So I've played a ton of games in my life, like to the point where it's almost concerning. But one series that I've always wanted to play that's just been sitting on my endless backlog for years at this point is the Yakuza series. I've always seen clips floating around of the wild combat, the various minigames, and the more comedic elements of the series and thought they looked awesome, but for whatever reason, I just haven't sat down to actually play them. That is, until this last week. After seeing the reveal of a certain pirate game, I decided that it was finally time to track down a copy of the original PS2 title and check this one off the backlog. So now that I've finally sat down and played it, how did I get on with Yakuza, and how well does the original hold up nowadays? Well, let's talk about it. Yakuza is an action-adventure game developed and published by Sega for the PlayStation 2 in 2005. In Yakuza, we play as Kazuma Kiryu, a well-respected lieutenant in one of Tokyo's many Yakuza crime families who's well on his way to becoming the head of his own family someday. In the intro of the game, Kiryu's best friend and sworn brother Nishikiyama ends up shooting and killing the head of their Yakuza family. Not wanting Nishikiyama to be killed by other members of the family, Kiryu decides to take the blame for the killing himself, which results in him being sent to prison for a crime that he didn't commit. While in prison, the Yakuza repeatedly send members into the prison system to try to kill Kiryu, and they obviously don't stop trying to kill him once he's released from prison 10 years later. Shortly after Kiryu's release, we learn that someone has stolen 10 billion yen from our former clan, and we also come across an orphan girl named Haruka who's being targeted by them for some unknown reason. So Kiryu not only has to readjust to normal life after 10 years in the joint, but also has to protect himself and this little girl from the people he once considered his family, while maybe figuring out who stole the 10 billion if he has the time to. This is a really strong setup for the story, and I found myself getting totally invested in it within like an hour of starting up the game. Another thing that pulled me in pretty much straight away was the game's presentation. In terms of just raw visual fidelity, Yakuza hasn't really aged all that well, with a ton of other PS2 games released the same year looking a lot better than it. But the game more than makes up for this with both its heavily cinematic presentation and lovingly crafted world. Starting with the cinematic presentation, things like the framing of cutscenes and the use of music to emphasize certain emotional beats is all spot on here. The presentation during the main story missions is fantastic, though it can often be let down by some inconsistent modeling and animation work that leaves certain scenes just looking a bit weird. Adding on to that, the game was originally voice acted fully in Japanese, but we got a full English dub for the West that's, well, it's certainly something.
You got some business with our bar or something?
I'm here to meet the owner, Kazuki.
Hey, shithead! What family do you work for anyway, huh? I bet you're from the Shimano family. We don't need to be taken care of by some gangsters.
What are you talking about? I'm just looking for Kazuki. I'm not Yakuza.
You think I'm a fucking idiot? Look at you, fuckhead! You couldn't be any more Yakuza if you tried.
Yeah, the English voice acting is bad, but like hilariously, deliciously bad. We are deep into so bad it's good territory here, which definitely adds to the charm if you're someone like me who enjoys some bad voice acting, but it definitely holds the game's story back in some of the more emotional scenes, since the acting just kind of falls flat the majority of the time. And it's very obvious that the dub's low quality is almost entirely due to bad direction, as the English dub actually has a bit of a rockstar cast. You've got actors like Michael Madsen, Mark Hamill, hell, Haruka is even voice acted by the same woman who played Jimmy fucking Neutron. There's a lot of amazing talent in the game's English cast, but the actors were receiving some of the worst voice direction that I've ever heard of in the industry. I won't be going over the entirety of it here for the sake of time, but we're talking things like asking the voice actors to match the cadence of their speech to the lip movements of the characters, and then just not providing them with the actual cutscenes as reference. No, seriously, what they ended up doing was just having the actors record a bunch of different takes while trying to guess what the cadence would be and changing up the speech pattern a little bit every single time. And then when the dub team went in to actually edit those lines into the game, they just picked which one they thought would fit best. The production of the English dub for this game is actually super interesting and also really well documented, so definitely take the time to look into it if that's something you're interested in. Onto the parts where Yakuza really shines though, this game has an awesome rendition of Tokyo. The game takes place in the fictional district of Kamurocho, which is supposed to be the nightlife capital of Tokyo within the Yakuza universe. Kamurocho is very heavily based on the real-life district of Kabukicho, which is one of Tokyo's largest and most well-known red light districts. During the game's development, Sega would regularly send designers and artists to Kabukicho to attend things like hostess clubs and get a deeper understanding of the area so that they could more accurately portray that side of Tokyo's culture within the game. To take this even further, they made deals with a number of Japanese chains and companies to place them within the game, with various real-world Japanese brands making appearances here, and players even being able to go shopping inside of a Don Quixote, a large Japanese retailer that, sure enough, still has a store location that's open in Kabukicho to this day that just so happens to be on the exact same street corner that it is in the game. This dedication to accurately portraying the nightlife world and culture of Tokyo really shines through in the final product here, and it makes it incredibly easy for the game to just pull you right into its world. And that's a huge plus for Yakuza, because this game uses a semi-open world structure. It's not this vast open world where you can go climb that mountain over there and it just works, but you're free to move around throughout the district of Kamurocho as you please. When moving through the streets of Kamurocho, the game switches to these fixed camera angles that frame the art team's work in a way that just looks really damn good. I mean, seriously, if there was ever an example of art direction over visual fidelity, this would be it. There's a ton of content packed into the district, and you could easily spend dozens of hours just getting lost in all of it between main story missions. Something you might expect from a game like this would be side missions, and yeah, Yakuza has a lot of those. The game has a whopping 78 side missions available, and while most of them are your average forgettable fetch quest, some of them more directly tie back into the main story and are really damn good. This small handful all have the same production quality of the main story missions, so these are absolutely worth your time to seek out, though I couldn't really blame you for skipping the rest. Thankfully though, if you're like me and the majority of the side missions aren't really your thing, there are a ton of random minigames scattered throughout Kamurocho that you can go and mess around with. You can head over to the arcade and play some claw machine games, swing by the batting cages for a few minutes, develop a crippling addiction to gambling at the casino, you name it. There's also a ton of other side activities available here, like an underground fighting ring that you can participate in for some extra cash, and hostess bars where you can go and burn all of your money for just a few minutes of a woman's attention. And if you ever need more money for the hostess clubs, just go to the roulette table and bet an equal amount on every number 1 through 32. This will give you an 89% chance of winning on every spin, and every win will net you a 12% profit. No need to thank me, I'm just looking out for my fellow gamers here. Jokes aside though, there's seriously a ton of side content here in Yakuza, so if you're someone like me who likes to just go around and enjoy being a part of the game world from time to time, then this game would be right up your alley. But when you're not going around doing side quests or playing mini games, you'll spend the majority of your time in Yakuza getting into some good old-fashioned street fights. The combat can be incredibly fun and flashy when it's firing on all cylinders, but there's a good bit of that first game wonkiness going on here. This is also the part of the game that I probably have the most opinions on, so buckle up because we might be here for a bit. At a base level, the combat in Yakuza is your typical beat-em-up combat. You've got your light and your heavy attacks, each bound to their own button on the controller, and pressing different combinations of light and heavy attacks will result in Kiryu throwing out a variety of unique combo strings. You can also press the circle button on the controller to grab an enemy, which then allows you to hit them with light attacks, heavy attacks, or throw them at their friends for better crowd control. Landing attacks on enemies will slowly build up your heat meter, which essentially acts as a sort of flow state for Kiryu. Once you fill up the meter to a certain amount, you'll enter heat mode, and being in heat will give you a variety of different buffs. You'll deal more damage, your attacks will come out faster, and enemies will have a harder time knocking you down. On top of that, you'll also gain access to a variety of what the game calls heat moves, which allow you to cash in those passive buffs of the heat mode to instead get a massive burst of damage. These heat moves also allow you to access a variety of environmental attacks, with Kiryu being able to grab an enemy and drag them over to a wall or a table to slam them into it. These environmental attacks are super fun, and I always love seeing some environmental interactions in a PS2 game. And to top it all off, there are a ton of weapons that you can find laying around the environments, from broken pipes to pieces of furniture. These all come complete with their own heat moves that allow you to do things like slam someone over the head with a couch. Once again, just fun additions that really add to the depth of the combat. Defeating enemies or completing side quests will also grant you experience points, which can then be used to level up Kiryu's abilities across 3 different categories. The heat and the body categories will increase things like Kiryu's heat meter and health capacity, and the technique category will open up things like new combos or throws. Certain techniques can also be learned by training with a martial arts master that you'll meet roughly halfway through the game. The coolest example of this is how Kiryu will swing swords around like a club early on in the game, but after enough training with this new master, he'll actually learn how to use swords properly, leading to more effective combos and just a generally higher damage output while using them. These add a nice progression to the game and allow you to really have a ton of options available to you by the end of a playthrough. So like I said, the combat here is really fun when it's working as intended, but oh man is it clunky. The main issue here is that there's no soft lock-on system that makes it easier to consistently hit combos on enemies, at least not one that the game tells you about. See, you can get a soft lock-on by holding L1 on the controller when facing an enemy, but the game doesn't teach you this in the tutorial. This means that for the first couple hours of the game, you'll likely be struggling with getting Kiryu to actually hit his enemies instead of just swinging into the air aimlessly more than anything else. And even once you know about the lock-on mechanic, it's not exactly good. Kiryu will only actually lock onto an enemy if they're right in front of him when you press the button, and he also frequently loses his lock-on if the enemy does something like sidestep you or just run to another position. This might not sound so bad, but holding the lock-on button will also prevent Kiryu from turning and keep him facing in one direction. So pretty much the whole time you're in combat, you'll be fighting the lock-on system more than anything else. Now, judging by the success of the franchise overall and how much people love the combat in these games, I'm assuming that it gets significantly better in later entries, but it's just really janky here in the original. That's not the only major combat mechanic that the game doesn't teach you though, with the game also having some dodge and block mechanics that are never taught to the player. It's crazy to me that the game doesn't teach these 2 mechanics in the tutorial, as enemies hit pretty damn hard here, and these are literally your only 2 defensive options outside of just running away. And I get that a lot of people will say, well, you're supposed to read the manual, but when you open your game with a combat tutorial that forces players to do the same action over and over again to make sure they understand everything, it's more than reasonable for players to assume that the game taught them everything they'll need to know to succeed later on. Blocking and dodging are essential for pretty much any difficult combat encounter in this game, so I have absolutely no idea why this isn't taught to the player with the rest of the essentials that are in the tutorial. And while we're on the topic of things that I don't love about Yakuza's combat, the boss fights in this game are a bit of a mixed bag. The bosses all have awesome personalities and look really cool when fighting, but the actual boss mechanics tend to be a bit wonky. A lot of them have a ton of attacks that they can't be hit out of, which takes Yakuza's very free-flowing and expressive combat and turns it into a game where you wait for the boss to throw an attack so that you can block and throw a quick punish out before repeating that over and over again for minutes on end. It's not the worst by any means, but I found myself getting super hyped up when the game would introduce a boss, just to be let down when I realized how restrictive they were. I wanted to have these epic battles where we both throw these crazy moves and combos back and forth, but I almost never got that experience here in Yakuza. I'm sure that once again, this is something that gets better with later entries, but I just wasn't a huge fan of the boss fights here. And one last thing that I don't love about the combat is less of an issue with the combat itself and more of an issue with the overall design of the game. As you're running around the city going from point A to point B, you'll get ambushed by random gang members and other Yakuza along the way, and these side battles can get really annoying because of just how constant they are. I totally get why they're here, as players need some way to be able to farm experience and money when they need it, but these battles just feel way too frequent. Doing just about anything in the game that requires you to run from one side of the city to the other takes way longer than it really needs to, since you're also going to get stopped for a street fight roughly 4 or 5 times per trip. And by trip, I don't mean round trip like going there and then going back to where you first started the activity, I mean just going from one point to another. I really enjoyed running around Kamurocho and experiencing everything the district had to offer, But by the time I had played the game for a few hours, I felt like the pacing was being seriously held back by these random fights. If we took it from 4 or 5 fights along the way to your objective and brought it down to just 1 or 2, I think it would feel a lot smoother and more natural. I have no idea if this gets toned down in later games or not, but I really do hope that there are either less random battles or just some other way of remedying the pacing issues that come from them. That's about everything I wanted to talk about when it comes to Yakuza's gameplay though. So from here, we're going to be going into a lot more detail about the game's story. This means that I'm going to be spoiling a good bit of what happens later on in the game, so if you want to avoid spoilers about Yakuza's main plot, skip to the timestamp right here. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, just after Kiryu is released from prison, we learn that someone stole 10 billion yen from the Tojo clan, the Yakuza that Kiryu was formerly a member of. And just after that revelation, we also learn that someone has murdered the leader of the Tojo clan, leaving all the smaller families within it disorganized and suspicious of one another. This of course leads to a ton of infighting between the families throughout the game, as all of them not only suspect each other of having stolen the money, but they're now all fighting over who gets to take the spot as the new chairman of the clan as well. After having some run-ins with the various families ourselves, we're approached by Date, an organized crime detective who was partially responsible for us being put away 10 years prior. He's investigating the murder of the Tojo clan's chairman and also wants to know who stole the 10 billion yen, so he decides to team up with Kiryu to try to get to the bottom of it all. And I have to say, this Date guy might just be one of the most likable partner characters that I've seen in a very long time. He may be an aging detective, but that doesn't stop him from mouthing off at his superiors in the police force when he suspects they're covering things up, or even joining us in the fighting to protect his own daughter. He's an absolute Chad who does whatever he thinks is right regardless of how it might come back to bite him in the ass, and I really loved him for that. After meeting Date, we also meet Haruka, an orphan who's run away from the orphanage to try to find her mother. Haruka seems to somehow be directly linked to the stolen 10 billion yen. So Kiryu decides to take her in and protect her, at least until they get to the bottom of everything. Throughout the game, players will see Kiryu grow to care more and more for Haruka, and she starts to trust him more as things go on as well. She brings out a totally different side of Kiryu's character that we don't really get to see anywhere else, so as a result, she ends up being one of my favorite parts of the game's story. In terms of the villains though, there are many that we get to see throughout the game that I won't really be mentioning, but there are a couple of them that definitely deserve to be brought up here. The first is a man named Goro Majima. Majima is an incredibly charismatic and unpredictable villain who also happens to be the head of the Majima family within the Tojo clan. On top of that, he just so happens to be the character that I mentioned earlier who's voiced by Mark Hamill. And if you've ever seen Mark Hamill play an unhinged and unpredictable villain before, you'll know just how naturally he fits the role here. We don't actually get to see a ton of Majima, with him only making like 3 appearances throughout the game. But based on the trailer of a certain pirate game that's coming out soon, I have a sneaking suspicion that I'll see a good bit of him throughout the series. The primary antagonist of the game ends up being Nishikiyama, our best friend from the beginning who we took the fall for. After we get sent to prison, Nishikiyama ends up losing everyone else close to him as well, which causes him to become an opportunistic weasel who will do whatever it takes to climb to the top. Throughout the years we were gone, he essentially ended up taking our spot as the head of a new Tojo clan family, with him being promoted and granted the privilege of starting the Nishikiyama family. He tries to kill us numerous times throughout the game, sending his own men as well as other Yakuza families to carry out the deed. And on the rare occasion that he and Kiryu actually get to have a conversation, he has this sort of cold and unfeeling attitude towards him, only really caring about getting Kiryu out of the picture and securing the 10 billion for himself. He's an incredibly interesting and well-written character, and probably tied for my favorite in the game alongside Detective Date. Near the end of the game, we find out that the former leader of the Tojo clan actually moved and hid the 10 billion yen himself and wrote down a will just in case something happened to him. In the will he wrote, he includes that he wants Kazuma Kiryu to take his place as the chairman of the Tojo clan, meaning that Kiryu got the position that Nishikiyama always wanted without needing to backstab those close to him just to get there. And then there's the last antagonist introduced right at the end of the game in Kyohei Jingu, a corrupt politician who was using the Yakuza for things like money laundering and bribery. We also learn near the end that Kiryu's ex-girlfriend Yumi had gotten into a relationship with Jingu after Kiryu was sent to prison, and these two are actually Haruka's biological parents. Jingu attempts to kill Kiryu, Yumi, and Haruka to get the three of them out of his way so that he can take the 10 billion yen and use it to spread his influence and corruption even further. Kiryu of course steps in though and kicks his ass as well as the asses of all of his men, putting a stop to his plans before he can execute them. Just after this, we get the final battle between Kiryu and Nishikiyama, with the two of them getting shirtless so they can show off their awesome back tattoos and have a manly fistfight to the death at the top of a tower. This is hands down the hardest fight in the game, but Kiryu ends up winning of course, once again showing that his ideals are superior to Nishikiyama's. After Nishikiyama is knocked out though, Jingu suddenly reappears and shoots Kiryu in the leg, taking away his ability to actually fight back. He then goes over to shoot and kill Kiryu, but just then, Nishikiyama comes back out of nowhere, stabbing Jingu and blowing the two of them up along with the 10 billion yen to redeem himself for everything he's done over the past decade. And weirdly, Nishikiyama's sacrifice might have been the most emotional moment in the game for me. I feel like it shouldn't have been considering how little of Nishikiyama we actually got to see throughout the game, but just something about his sudden change of heart and the way that Kiryu reacted to it really got to me. Shortly after, the police come in to find only Kiryu and Haruka left in the tower, but Date shows up just in time to stop them from arresting Kiryu. Kiryu tells him that there's no point in stopping them, and that they should just take him to prison anyway since he's lost everything and everyone that made his life worth living. But Date argues that there's still one thing that Kiryu has left that's worth fighting for, and gestures to Haruka. Kiryu realizes that he's right and takes his advice, and the game ends with him officially retiring from the Yakuza and his life of crime to adopt Haruka and live a normal life with her. I found Yakuza's story to be a real highlight of the game. Sure, it's held back by its crappy English localization and dubbing, but the writing still manages to shine through and give players a really strong and entertaining story. There's so much of it that I didn't even talk about here for the sake of time, but the way that the game sets up questions and mysteries and builds up to giving players the answers to them is just really well done. Despite the flaws that it has, it still managed to keep me on the edge of my seat the entire time and delivered some incredibly emotional moments near the end. I thought Kiryu's character was especially strong, with him learning throughout the game that even in spite of all the loss he's been through, he can still push forward and change his destiny. So I would say that even in the original PS2 release, Yakuza is worth playing even if it's just for the story. And overall, in case you guys couldn't tell, I enjoyed my time with Yakuza quite a bit. I feel the same way about the game as a whole as I do the story. It definitely has its issues and its places where it falls flat, but it's really satisfying and enjoyable on the whole. It's got some clunky combat and some overly restrictive boss fights, but it didn't hold me back from enjoying the game, and I'm sure it will get better in later entries. It has a terrible English dub that holds the game's story back, but I know that that will be fixed as early as Yakuza 2. The game has so much depth to it, but it also has this feeling of simplicity that makes it really easy to just sit down and play for hours on end. Part of that is also just the awesome atmosphere that the game's cinematic presentation and dedication to presenting the more underground sides of Tokyo's culture bring to the table. It seriously feels like my 20+ hour playthrough for this video only scratched the surface of what this game has to offer, and I really look forward to going back to it and experiencing every last bit of it. Which, by the way, I'll be doing on stream right here on the channel, and if you're watching this video the day it goes public, there's a solid chance that I'm doing that right now. I know, subtle plug. I'm really surprised by how much I enjoyed this game, as I've always heard people talk about the original PS2 release as one that new players should just avoid, so I always just assumed that the original PS2 release is way more rough than it actually is. If you're a new player looking to check the series out for yourself, I honestly recommend at least giving this one a shot if you can get your hands on a copy of it. And if you're a veteran of the series who's just never gone back to play the actual original, I think you'd be surprised by just how good of a start this one got the series off to, especially with how people tend to talk about it nowadays. It's a bit of a rocky ride at times, but it's one that I'm ultimately glad I went on. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Yakuza a 7.8. Hey guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you made it this far, I'm going to assume that you enjoyed what you saw, so if you did, maybe consider checking out my Patreon or YouTube memberships. Support like this really helps a lot with allowing me to make videos on the things that I'm interested in, and not just what will get me the most clicks, so any generosity is greatly appreciated. If you're not interested or you just don't have the means to right now, don't sweat it, because things like watching the video all the way through and leaving a like or a comment already go a super long way. Anyway, thank you again for watching, and I hope to see all of you guys right back here when we cover Yakuza 2. I'll talk to you all then.